I thank Ms. Doughton for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Kathleen Howarth.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the opportunity to brief the Council on the bombardment of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The Council's focus on this matter comes as waves of attacks sweep across Ukraine, targeting power generation and transmission facilities nationwide. A week ago, missile strikes caused serious damage to 3 thermal plants and 2 hydroelectric power plants. A few days ago, another large-scale infrastructure attack was reported. By some counts, nearly every single power plant has been targeted. On 29 February of this year, Yale Humanitarian Research Lab released a report documenting verified damage to Ukraine's power generation and transmission infrastructure that took place between 1 October of 2022 and 30 April 2023, a period of just 31 weeks. Through a combination of open-source data and satellite imagery analysis, HRL identified 223 damage events across 23 of Ukraine's 24 oblasts, and we verified 66 of those events to our rigorous high-confidence standards across 17 oblasts. That's a rate of over 7 damage events identified per week, with peak impact timed for the height of winter. Just last Wednesday, almost a dozen Ukrainian power facilities were reportedly struck in a single day, from 7 averaged a week to nearly a dozen in a day. Since March of 2024, successful targeting of power generation facilities has further slashed Ukraine's capacity. Each hit compounds the problem. Russia's officials have clearly stated their objectives for targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. First, to advance Russia's military objectives. Second, as retaliation for Ukraine's purported actions. And third, as the intentional infliction of harm upon civilians to compel Ukraine to submit to negotiations favorable to Russia's interests. While the first justification may be lawful within the bounds of the laws of war, retaliation and intentional infliction of harm likely violate international humanitarian law. Yale HRL did not assess the degree of dual use afforded by the energy infrastructure documented in our report. However, the law of armed conflict prohibits attacks on both civilian objects and military targets if the attack causes excessive civilian casualties or damage to civilian objects, or a combination, relative to any concrete or direct military advantage anticipated. As State Duma member Andrei Guryulov defined Russia's campaign, it is aimed against Ukraine's whole energy systems. A comprehensive campaign, by its own definition, defies proportionality. Russia's officials used language that indicates a disregard for the extent of civilian suffering in apparent contravention of Additional Protocol 1, particularly Article 57's obligation for parties to take constant care to spare the civilian population, civilians, and civilian objects. Beyond expressing a disregard for civilian suffering, officials have stated that they are utilizing that suffering to compel Ukraine to negotiate on terms favorable to Russia. As Dmitry Medvedev wrote in October 2022, in order for Ukraine to stabilize its energy supply, it must, quote, recognize Russia's legitimate demands in the context of the special military operation and its results. Then the lights will work again. Or as Boris Chernyshov said when he called strikes on Ukraine's power infrastructure strikes of retribution for purported and unspecified war crimes. For that, they will sit there without gas and without electricity and without everything. What does it mean to go without gas and without electricity and without everything? It means that too much pressure is put on other parts of Ukraine's critical infrastructure, causing cascading problems and further damage. It means extended periods without water. It means jobs are ground to a halt, productivity is lost, and education is fragmented. It means blackouts last longer than the emergency batteries on life-saving healthcare equipment. The impact of these strikes cannot be assessed only by logging damage to facilities. It will take far more to understand the scope and scale of the harm done to Ukraine's civilians, including lives lost. As Ukraine's officials have comprehensively planned and executed their destruction of Ukraine's critical infrastructure, so should the international community systematically counteract this devastation. First, target the missiles. Sanctions already in place must be enforced to ensure that weapons components and the resupply of other critical elements are stopped at the borders of countries that already recognize these sanctions regimes. We must track these components and target Russia's missiles at their source. Second, prepare for this emergency. Mobilize resources today to support and stabilize Ukraine's economy and ensure that emergency humanitarian aid is in motion now to ensure civilian survival this winter. Third, let Russia pay. Release Russian assets seized under global sanctions to fund these emergency preparations over the next 6 months, work that cannot begin soon enough. Above all else, do not underestimate the scale of this threat. Russia's wholesale destruction of Ukraine's energy infrastructure targets the heart of its civilian population. If it is allowed to bleed from 1,000 cuts, hope will drain away. But every action that makes this heart stronger makes all of Ukraine more capable of defending itself. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Howarth for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France. You have the floor.
Mr. President, I wish to thank Madam Dalton and Madam Howarth for their statements. For more than 800 days now, the Russian Federation has been persisting in its war of aggression against Ukraine in violation of international law and the United Nations Charter. Russia has been pursuing its violations of international humanitarian law and has been waging a campaign of deliberate strikes targeting civilian objects. Russia has been carrying this strategy out at the cost of a heavy human toll and the alarming deterioration of the humanitarian situation. We have just heard that the Russian army has been systematically targeting Ukrainian energy production units, including thermal power plants, hydroelectric power plants, substations, and transformers. This campaign began in the winter of 2022 to 2023. It has intensified since February of 2024 and has culminated with large-scale salvos in late March and early April. 50% of Ukrainian energy production capacities has been destroyed or damaged. Russia has been striking at Kharkiv and Odessa on an almost daily basis with ballistic missiles. These are strikes targeting the depth of the territory of Ukraine, far from the front lines. They are not in any way geared towards achievement of any military objectives. They are targeting civilian infrastructure, which is critical for populations. This runs counter to the core principles of IHL for the protection of civilians, distinction, and proportionality. This reflects the fact that Russia has no concern when it comes to possible precautions being taken to mitigate the wounds inflicted upon civilians and damage to civilian objects. France will continue to deliver support for international justice. The arrest warrants issued on 5 March 2024 by the ICC against Sergei Ivanovich Kobilach, Lieutenant General of the Russian Aerospace Forces, and Viktor Nikolaevich Sokolov, Vice Admiral of the Russian Black and Russian Black Sea Fleet commander related to the campaign of missile strikes against Ukrainian civilian energy infrastructure are a decisive step forward. France also applauds the renewal of the mandate of the Independent Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council, which has been documenting indiscriminate attacks against populations and critical infrastructure in Ukraine. President, while Russia has been carrying out devastating attacks targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure, Ukraine and the rest of the world has been acting to mitigate the humanitarian consequences of this war, to provide support to the populations by stepping up the resilience of strategic infrastructure. This is an issue which will be subject to discussions during the Conference for Peace organized by Switzerland next month. Their only way towards a fair and lasting peace is the path that is respectful of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank the representative of France for their statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador. You have the floor.
Gracias. Thank you, President. I thank Ms. Doughton and Ms. Haworth for their detailed briefings. Ecuador has noted with concern that the conflict in Ukraine is worsening and spreading, exacerbating the suffering of the civilian population and creating additional risks which may affect regional and global stability. The statistics are alarming. More than 10,000 civilians have lost their lives since the beginning of the conflict, including hundreds of children. More than 20,000 people have been wounded, and millions have been displaced. Since the last time this Council discussed the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, the intensity and frequency of attacks has continued to escalate. Essential infrastructure, which includes hospitals and schools, have been destroyed or seriously damaged. This month alone, we have seen attacks which have disabled a number of energy installations, affecting access of millions of people to basic services such as electricity and drinking water. In recent days in the Kharkiv region, the impact of the attacks has been equally devastating, with many civilian victims and a significant increase in IDPs. We must recall that international humanitarian law is explicit in prohibiting attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. That being said, Ecuador appeals to the parties to adhere strictly to the principles of proportionality, distinction, and precaution to avoid an escalation of this cycle of suffering. Safe and unfettered delivery of humanitarian aid must be allowed and facilitated, and the life and safety of humanitarian workers must be respected and protected. Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues, Ecuador maintains a clear-positioned principle on this and other conflicts. We reject any violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, and we support the peaceful settlement of disputes. The most effective way to put an end to the devastation suffered by civilians is a definitive cessation of hostilities. Until the weapons are silenced, the suffering of innocents will continue to rise, regardless of humanitarian efforts or protection measures that have been implemented, and therefore Ecuador urges the Russian Federation to put an end to its military operations in Ukraine and to comply with the ruling of the ICJ from the 16th of March 2022, and to make room for dialogue and diplomacy, the legitimate and effective ways for promoting peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Lisa Doughton for the comprehensive update and note the contribution of Ms. Caitlin Howard. I also welcome the participation of the representatives of Ukraine, Germany, Estonia, Poland, Denmark, and the European Union in today's meeting. Mr. President, despite the many calls by this Council for full compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law, and for the parties to the conflict to comply with the legal requirement to protect civilian objects, they continue to be destroyed almost daily. Guyana is deeply alarmed by the unrelenting attacks on residential buildings, schools, medical facilities, grain ports, and energy facilities since the start of this war in February 2022. We are also concerned that these attacks were often unrelated to frontline engagement and appear to have little regard for the requirements of proportionality and military necessity. International humanitarian law is clear in its prohibition of attacks targeting civilians and objects indispensable to the survival of civilians. Yet, we continue to witness large-scale coordinated attacks on civilian infrastructure, including dozens of energy facilities, resulting in disrupted access to electricity and water supply for millions of people in multiple locations. The damage, destruction, or loss of functionality of energy facilities are having direct and reverberating effects on civilians. They are not only causing incidental civilian harm through the disruption of access to critical services, but are also resulting in loss of civilian life and injury to those living in nearby target sites, near to target sites. There have also been attacks on the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant ZNPP in Ukraine. Despite the many calls for an end to attacks on or near the site, the IAEA team of experts stationed at the site continues to report hearing military activities, including artillery and rocket fire in areas near the plant. This cannot and must not continue. Greater care must be taken to eliminate the persistent dangers posed to the safety of the ZNPP and to adhering to the 5 concrete principles and 7 indispensable pillars for ensuring nuclear safety at the site. Guyana reiterates its call for the parties to respect and adhere to international humanitarian law. We also urge them to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict and call for the withdrawal of Russian military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. We maintain that prolonging this war poses increasingly grave risks for all concerned and for international peace and security. We further call for scaled-up humanitarian support to Ukraine and for humanitarian workers to be granted unhindered access to all areas, including the occupied territories. In closing, Mr. President, Guyana once again encourages the continued engagement of the international community to end this war as soon as possible. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Doughton and Ms. Howard for their valuable briefings. It is regrettable that we heard again today in a briefing from the UN about the many civilian casualties caused by the clear violation of the UN Charter by a permanent member of the Security Council. Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine has resulted in the deaths and injuries of countless innocents, exacerbated the humanitarian crisis on the ground. Energy-related facilities throughout Ukraine are under continuous attack. On May 8th, President Zelensky said that Kiev, Zaporizhia, and other regions have been attacked with more than 50 missiles and 20 drones. The Energy Minister of Ukraine said that about 80% of thermal power plants have been damaged. We also note that OCHA reports intensified attacks in the Kharkiv region are causing civilian casualties, widespread destruction, and displacement from frontline and border areas. Japan is deeply distressed by Russia's continuous disregard for international law, including international humanitarian law, IHL. Attacks against civilians and critical civilian infrastructure are clearly prohibited by IHL. The international community will not tolerate impunity for those responsible and perpetrators of violations of IHL, and all heinous acts must be identified and held accountable. In addition, Japan condemns in the strongest possible terms North Korea's export and Russia's procurement of ballistic missiles as well as Russia's use of these missiles against Ukraine. The transfer of those weapons, which is a clear violation of the relevant Security Council resolutions, supports Russia's war of aggression and increases the suffering of the Ukrainian people. We continue to monitor closely what North Korea gains in return. Mr. President, needless to say, a stable energy supply is foundation to people's lives. To this end, Japan has supported the recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. This includes provisions of 2 large auto transformers, benefiting around 500,000 residents in Kiev, and the delivery of 6 mobile power supply vehicles to the Ukrainian Seaports Authority. Additionally, Japan has supplied 5 advanced gas turbines and transported 7 auto transformers to help prevent energy shortages and maintain critical services for the over 5 million people during the challenging winter months. Japan remains committed to supporting the Ukrainian people through bolstering the electricity and heating supplies in Ukraine. Mr. President, once again, we reiterate our clear position to urge Russia to stop the aggression and immediately and unconditionally withdraw from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Japan continues to stand with the people of Ukraine and the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria. You have it.
سيد الرئيس بداية أود أن أشكر ليزا داوتن.
Mr. President, allow me to begin by thanking Ms. Lisa Doughton for her briefing. I also followed with great interest the briefing provided by Ms. Caitlin Howard. Mr. President, in a number of meetings, Algeria has expressed its great concern at the worsening humanitarian situation in the crisis in Ukraine and this mindset of confrontation which reigns over the situation between the parties. It has tragic repercussions on civilians and ramifications regionally and internationally. The loss of civilian life, the suffering of refugees and IDPs, the destruction of the civilian infrastructure, including energy power plants, are a source of great concern to us. In addition to that, there is worsening in tensions, the pursuit of hostilities, and an exacerbation of this polarized situation which has a dangerous repercussions in the international arena, without mentioning the economic fallout and impact and the social impact, in particular in the energy sector. We therefore reiterate our appeal for diplomatic efforts to be pursued in order to avoid a further humanitarian crisis and to address the humanitarian suffering without any distinction. Cessation of hostilities is needed. Civilians must be protected, and the UN Charter and international law, including international humanitarian law, must be respected. Algeria calls on all parties to set aside this mindset of confrontation and to find what is needed in order to restore comprehensive dialogue and constructive dialogue on the basis of the principles of the peaceful settlement of disputes, and we urge the parties to direct their efforts to find a just and lasting solution to the crisis in Ukraine, basing themselves on the goals and purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the legitimate concerns of both parties. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom. You have the floor, Matt.
Thank you, President. And I thank Director Lisa Doughton and Director Caitlin Howarth for their informative briefings. This spring, Russia has targeted power plants, electricity substations, and gas storage facilities across Ukraine. The United Kingdom calls for an immediate halt to this destructive campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Millions of people already face disruption to power, heating, and water supply. These attacks are making an appalling humanitarian situation worse. This is especially the case for frontline communities, as the attacks and lack of power hamper humanitarian partners' communications and movements. The most recent attack on the 8th of May involved over 70 missiles and drones. Since March, at least 14 power stations have been hit. Iranian-made UAVs remain Russia's weapons of choice in these attacks against civilians and their infrastructure. Colleagues, Russia has targeted Ukraine's energy infrastructure since the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022, and before that. In 2015, thousands of consumers experienced power outages when Russia hacked Ukrainian energy grids. Now, this pattern of Russian aggression continues in an attempt to terrorize civilians, obstruct livelihoods and businesses, and ultimately to break down Ukraine's resolve. But Ukrainians will not allow Russia to do that. The UK has committed $55 million to the Energy Community's Ukraine Energy Support Fund and over $214 million in overall support to the energy sector in Ukraine. We encourage donors to support this fund, to consider rapid provision of new or refurbished energy equipment, and to help provide air defence systems to protect Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. Together, we will help Ukraine repair, restore, and defend its energy infrastructure. One country could end this wanton destruction and suffering immediately. The United Kingdom calls on Russia to cease its attacks and withdraw from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their floor. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, OCHA Director Doughton, for your sobering briefing. I'd also like to thank Ms. Howarth for her well-researched presentation today. Mr. President, it has been over a month since our last meeting on the devastating humanitarian toll of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, including the country's energy and critical infrastructure. Civilians continue to bear the brunt. Reports continue of Russian forces committing torture, sexual violence, and the forced transfers and deportations of civilians, including children. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission verified that at least 604 civilians were killed or injured in Ukraine in March alone, a 20% increase from February. At least 57 of them were children. Millions of people have been left without electricity because of Russia's coordinated attacks on Ukraine's grid infrastructure, power generation, and natural gas infrastructure. These large-scale attacks striking Ukraine's cities and infrastructure are a clear escalation. They threaten critical services, including electricity, water treatment, and heating. Power plants in Kharkiv are operating at 20% capacity due to nearly daily attacks, forcing the evacuation of tens of thousands of civilians. Mr. President, next week, this Council will be subjected to yet another meeting where Russia will claim that Western arms are to blame for prolonging the war it started. Russia only need look in the mirror to understand why more than 50 countries have provided critical support for Ukraine's forces. Last month, the United States announced a $1 billion in new assistance to Ukraine. This assistance includes urgently needed capabilities like air defense equipment to defend Ukraine's citizens from Russia's relentless attacks. Since February 2022, the United States has also provided nearly $2.9 billion in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and neighboring countries. This includes life-saving support for the 3.4 million people who remain internally displaced and nearly 6.5 million refugees. Newly approved supplemental funding will help maintain the humanitarian response amidst unabated attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. The recent increase in Russian attacks reinforces the need for urgent humanitarian support to reach the 14.6 million people in need of assistance. We urge donors to support the humanitarian response through the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund or other partners. Mr. President, it bears repeating that Russia continues to deny international monitors and humanitarian organizations access to Ukrainian territory it occupies, as well as to facilities in Russia holding POWs and Ukrainian civilians. It bears repeating that Russia continues to procure ballistic missiles and other munitions from the DPRK in violation of Security Council resolutions. Fearing the mounting body of evidence against it, the Kremlin vetoed the mandate renewal for the DPRK panel of experts. It bears repeating that Russia continues to acquire Iranian UAVs, which are being used relentlessly against Ukraine's cities and civilian infrastructure. Mr. President, after over 3 years, the toll of Russia's aggression against Ukraine is well documented and researched. No amount of lies and diversions can cover up the sheer body of evidence. There will be accountability. But in the meantime, the way to end this war and the humanitarian crisis it has caused is clear. Russia must cease its aggression and immediately and fully withdraw from all territory within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, in what is now becoming a tradition, our Western colleagues once a month gather us here, all of us here to hold meetings on Ukraine, the sole purpose of which is to demonstrate the steadfast support of the collective West for the Zelensky regime, which is on the cusp of complete collapse. These meetings are now becoming sessions of collective self-hypnosis, which are intended first and foremost for the domestic Western audience. And at the same time, not a single utterance of truth about what is happening in Ukraine, nor about the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis, will you hear from Western colleagues. The Kiev regime sponsors, including those who are queuing up, namely non-members of the Security Council, EU countries, instead of this are engaging in trotting out tall tales, terrifying tall tales about the situation in Ukraine, and are attempting to create the impression about the intolerable suffering of civilians as a result of the actions of the Russian Federation. It is difficult to do this, rather difficult for them to do this, insofar as the Russian aerospace force strikes against facilities which are related to the military capabilities of the Kiev regime, are high precision in nature. The lives of Ukrainian cities are proceeding normally on the whole, if we are not to take into account the rounding up of Ukrainian men who the Ukrainian dictator is throwing into the front as cannon fodder against their will. This is an issue which we will return to later. We do not pity our Western colleagues insofar as these allegations appear odd, given the numerous video rolls with the destruction of alleged civilian objects in Ukraine. I refer to elevators, post offices, stores, and so on. These are images which clearly show the form of the detonation of munitions and fuel. It is sufficiently difficult to also explain why, after the strikes on alleged peaceful hotels and areas of relaxation on the internet, there are hundreds of obituaries of Ukrainian military personnel which appear. And at the same time, Western capitals continue to demonstrate a selective blindness when it comes to the crimes perpetrated by the UAF insofar as they run counter to the mendacious portrayal of the world which they're trying to impose on their societies. In this picture in Ukraine, there are no violations of human rights and thousands of political prisoners. There is no Russophobia, no nationalism, no glorification of and whitewashing of the henchmen of Hitler, who claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Jews, Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians during the war, denying the sole argument. They use the single argument to deny all of this, and that argument being that the president of Ukraine is a Jew. Mr. President, if our Western colleagues were striving to convey to the international community at least an iota of the truth about what is happening in Ukraine, then they would not sweep under the rug, but rather they would condemn the latest craven terrorist attack perpetrated the day before yesterday by the Kiev regime. For it is perfectly well known that on 12th of May, the peaceful Russian city of Belgorod once again was targeted by a large-scale missile strike. For this purpose, 3 types of missiles were used: a tactical Tochka-U missiles, the Olch MLRS, as well as the Czech-made Vampire systems. At 11:40 in the morning, as a result of the 5th attack during that day, one of the entrances of a residential building was destroyed. The missile was launched from the area of Volchansk, that is from the territory under Ukrainian control. 15 peaceful civilians died. 17 people received injuries at varying levels, including the victims included an infant, a month-and-a-half-old infant. Unfortunately, the shelling of Belgorod continued throughout the entire day, and the rescue operations had to be suspended several times even. On Sunday, another 3 people died. And this is just one instance of how those encountering the advancement of the Russian troops throughout the entire front and those experiencing more and more setbacks on the battlefield. I refer to Ukrainian nationalists. In their impotent rage, they are striving to shift their rage to target peaceful Russian cities, targeting them with strikes in a violation of the norms of international humanitarian law. Of course, for all of these crimes, first and foremost, the Zelensky regime is responsible. However, the culpability of Western countries at the same time is equal, insofar as the sponsors of the Kiev junta continue to provide it with long-range weapons, providing it with intelligence, and sending their instructors and mercenaries to Ukraine in the illusory hope of inflicting a strategic defeat upon the Russian Federation and seeking to attempt to weaken our country. We will have an opportunity to discuss these destructive actions of NATO countries in detail during a 20 May meeting, which will be convened at our initiatives. For this reason, we will not dwell on that right now. I will merely state that having abandoned hope of achieving the results, having lost hope in their proteges, the sponsors of the Kiev regime have now begun to explicitly and overtly provide permission or grant permission to target peaceful objects with the weapons that they have been providing. For example, in early May, the British Foreign Minister, James Cameron, made a revelatory statement that the weapons provided by London can be used to carry out strikes against Russian territory, including in areas beyond the special military operations confines. The Latvian Foreign Ministry also confirmed that Ukraine received weapons from partners with permission to strike against Russian territory. And at the same time, in Western capitals are shamelessly avoiding discussion of the openly used terrorist ISIL-like methods which are used by their proteges, organizing attacks against journalists and activists on Russian territory. In March, this went so far as to include a major terrorist attack which was ordered targeting Crocus City Hall in Moscow. And if we are to add to this the long-standing disregard of repressions against dissenters and those against the Kiev regime, for example, the death in the torture chambers of the Ukrainian security forces of a U.S. journalist, Gonzalo Lira, it is hardly surprising that the citizens of Western countries are putting more and more questions to their authorities, and they are denying these authorities of their support. For with their indulgence and collusion in the crimes of the Zelensky regime, they are trampling upon those very values which they portray as the core pillars of the democratic world. Present-day Ukraine no longer seeks to conceal its decaying anti-democratic neo-Nazi essence. For example, in April, Kyiv informed the Council of Europe about restrictions of the constitutional rights and freedoms of Ukrainians. In other words, the Zelensky regime took a decision thereby to formalize the long-standing practice of oppressing its own citizens. Information about staggering levels of violations of human rights in Ukraine is so difficult to sweep under the rug that even reports published in late April from the U.S. State Department points to numerous instances of torture, persecution against the church, arbitrary arrests, politically motivated killings. Letting off steam in this way, Washington, London, and Brussels, based on their customary practices, pin all the blame on Russia, at the same time forgetting that the persecution of dissenters and violations of human rights began in Ukraine long before the special military operations, at the very minimum, immediately following the anti-constitutional coup in Maidan 10 years ago. Distinguished colleagues, today the residents of Ukraine are encountering a qualitatively new level of violations of their rights. In just a few days, on the 18th of May, Ukrainian men of enlistment age will effectively become disenfranchised. With the entry into force of a new law on mobilization, they will find themselves outside the law. They will lose control of their property, monetary funds. They will no longer be able to renew or receive documents. And nonetheless, conscription evasion in Ukraine has reached staggering levels. This is exceedingly inconvenient for Zelensky and his sponsors, insofar as, according to their view of the world, the Ukrainians should readily march forth to defend their country. In fact, only in Romania, as became well known, 11,000 men of enlistment age fled. 19 people died in this attempt. In order to flee the country, potential enlistees abandoned their vehicles at the border. They don the garb of women and they carry out all sorts of clever tricks in order to deceive the border guards, their border guards. At the same time, the danger of entering the front is something which only the poor and disenfranchised face. The wealthy, of course, have opportunities to bribe their way out. And when it comes to the children of those holding power, that story is completely different. They have long been spending the funds stolen by their parents, including Western assistance, abroad. Colleagues, this is what is of concern to Ukrainians, not the lofty words of Western sponsors who are only interested in Ukrainians fighting on the front. And Ukrainian social networks, where the repressive machine of Zelensky has not yet reached, there are increasingly vociferous, seditious issues being raised. What are Ukrainians fighting for, and for whom? The arrogant, tainted by corruption Kyiv henchman and his clique who trampled upon their own constitution and are losing even their formal legitimacy on the 21st of May? Are they fighting for their Western geopolitical interests to weaken Russia? Ordinary Ukrainians are increasingly becoming to clearly understand that their interest in this war, which the U.S. and satellites prepared the country for at least since 2014, that they have no interest whatsoever here. Especially given that when they receive news about the lives in the territories liberated from the Kyiv regime, where former Ukrainian citizens finally are able to exercise their right to speak in their native tongue, in Russian. To conclude, I wish to turn to our colleagues from developing countries. Consider all of these trends, the sincerity of which you can easily see when next time you are called upon to support certain formulae or plans advanced by the Ukrainian henchman and his Western sponsors. They are so divorced from reality that any meetings during which the discussion of this is proposed to be held will become a pure loss of time. In the worst of cases, you will become complicit in prolonging the agony of the Kiev regime, and the cost of this will be tens, if not hundreds of thousands of the lives of ordinary Ukrainians who are being thrown into this pointless meat grinder, contrary to their will, contrary to the interest of their country. It is possible to stop this merely by sending away Zelensky and his clique and the entire Maidan authorities to put them where they deserve, namely the dustbin of history. And this is what we are seeking to achieve right now. Thank you.
I thank the Russian representative for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia. You have
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to thank Director Doughton for her briefing and Ms. Howard for her contribution. Mr. President, let me make a couple of points on behalf of my delegation. One, as the resident coordinator Denise Brown stated recently, there are no peaceful mornings in Ukraine. Since the last time we met on this file in early April, more than 1,000 drone and missile attacks were recorded across Ukraine. Cities like Kharkiv and Odessa were hit especially hard. Thousands of people have again been forced to flee as their homes are being destroyed, finding themselves in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. Aerial pounding of a critical civilian infrastructure is continuing unabated, as reportedly 140 educational facilities were damaged or destroyed in attacks across the country in 2024 alone. In parallel, UNICEF has reported that the rate at which children are dying has increased by nearly 40% in the first quarter of 2024 in comparison to the same period of last year. 2. Russia's use of cluster munitions. According to the latest reports, Russia has used cluster munitions in its bombardment of Odessa in late April. Using such weapons in a densely populated area is against all rules of international humanitarian law. In one instance, submunitions were reportedly scattered across a 1.5 km radius, which will pose a threat to civilian population for years to come. Slovenia, as a state party to the Convention on Cluster Munitions, condemns the use of these indiscriminate weapons in the strongest possible term. 3. Attacks against critical energy infrastructure. In the last month, millions of Ukrainians lost power as the result of Russian barrage of Ukrainian energy infrastructure. The country's energy sector was hit especially hard last week when 3 thermal power stations were damaged. The intensity of the recent attacks against critical energy infrastructure outpaces the one from winter of 2022-23. Let me recall the arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court against 2 Russian commanders who are alleged to be responsible for war crimes of directing attacks at civilian objects and inhumane acts, including the campaign of strikes against energy infrastructure carried out in that period. These attacks seek to impair Ukraine's economy and are obviously not directed against military targets. This is a clear violation of international humanitarian law, and it needs to stop now. Mr. President, Ukrainian civilians have suffered too long. They and the wider region need a tangible prospect for peace. We call on Russia to stop with its subversive actions and give peace a chance. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening this briefing. I also thank Ms. Lisa Dotson for her briefing. We acknowledge the contribution of Ms. Caitlin Howarth. I welcome the presence and participation of the representative of Ukraine in this meeting. Mr. President, 2 years since the start of the conflict in Ukraine have resulted in civilian deaths, widespread damage and destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, and vital civilian infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, leading to a dire humanitarian crisis. We are deeply concerned about the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which is being particularly exacerbated by attacks on critical energy infrastructure. Reports from Ukraine as recent as on 8 May suggest significant strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The attack reportedly caused significant damage to 3 thermal power plants, 4 hydroelectric power plants, 17 major high-voltage substations, and a gas storage facility in the Lviv region. Reports also suggest that the attacks have severely hampered Ukraine's energy capacity. More than 800 district heating facilities were destroyed or damaged, and up to 8 gigawatts of power generation was lost. 412 settlements remain offline, and hourly outages continue for household and industrial consumers in the Kharkiv and Kryvyi Rih Dnipropetrovsk regions. Overall, it is estimated that 50% of Ukraine's pre-conflict energy generating facilities are offline, and an estimated $1 billion will be needed for their restoration. We are concerned that attacks on the energy infrastructure have resulted in major disruptions in supply of essential services such as electricity, water, and gas to medical facilities, manufacturing industries, and places of work for a significant portion of the population. The impact on the provision of essential services slows down production levels and reduces economic activity. We are also alarmed by the impact on healthcare facilities, including those with incubators and other life-saving devices, which in some cases had to resort to the use of batteries that ran out before the establishment of power, putting the lives of many at risk. Mr. President, given the devastating impact of the conflict in Ukraine and parts of the Russian Federation on the civilian population, we call on the parties involved in the conflict to adhere to their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, including energy facilities in the circumstances. In acknowledging the efforts of the international community to address the humanitarian consequences of the conflict, we stress the urgent need for more coordinated international efforts to address the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. The 2024 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan for Ukraine must be fully supported to ensure the well-being and protection of civilians affected by the conflict. Let me close, Mr. President, by urging all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians and critical infrastructure, including energy generating and gas facilities, to prevent further harm and ensure the restoration of essential services for the well-being and stability of civilians. We reiterate our call for meaningful steps to be taken towards the immediate cessation of hostilities and the parties to the conflict to engage constructively in good faith towards finding a political and diplomatic solution, recognizing the legitimate concerns. We also reiterate our call for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you. I would like to thank Director Doughton and Ms. Howard for their briefings. As we have heard, the death and destruction toll are getting heavier by the day. At least 10,800 civilians have been killed, including 600 children, and more than 20,000 civilians have been injured. Also, according to the Ukraine Humanitarian Needs Response Plan, 14.6 million people are estimated to be in need of assistance across Ukraine. Malta remains seriously concerned by the lack of humanitarian access, and we urge Russia to allow and facilitate a safe, timely, and unimpeded access in line with its obligation under international humanitarian law. Russia's indiscriminate attacks further exacerbate the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine, with over 14 million people in need of assistance. We must also not forget that the humanitarian consequences of Russia's war go beyond Ukraine. Russia has weaponized food and undermined global food security by terminating the Black Sea Grain Initiative, as well as shelling Ukraine's grain storage and export facilities. Malta will continue to support the EU's solidarity lanes, as well as all efforts aimed to address the humanitarian consequences of Russia's aggression. President, not a single week passes without airstrikes destroying the lives of thousands of Ukrainians. We once again condemn, in the strongest possible terms, the ongoing Russian aerial assaults on cities and critical infrastructure across Ukraine. Just last week, Russia carried out one of the biggest aerial assaults against Ukrainian power generation and transmission facilities in several regions. This deadly trend encompasses daily drone, missile, rocket, and artillery attacks in Kharkov, Odessa, Kherson, Donetsk, regions. These attacks are yet another example of Russia's disregard for human life, since they have disrupted vital services such as electricity, heating, water, gas, and other essential services for hundreds of thousands of civilians. As of today, more than 800 heat supply facilities have been destroyed or damaged, and the attacks have caused more than $1 billion worth of damage to the energy sector. Malta expresses its concern about the humanitarian consequences that this may cause, given reports that the latest energy disruptions will last for several months due to the extent of the widespread damage. Continuous attacks on schools and medical facilities are also having far-reaching consequences, making access to essential healthcare and education even more challenging and impacting the basic rights to health and education. According to the World Health Organization, solely in the first trimester of 2024, there have been more than 70 attacks on healthcare providers, supplies, facilities, warehouses, and transport in Ukraine. This is unacceptable. The impact of the war is also linked to mental health risks and trauma amongst millions of Ukrainians. Children have endured the loss of family members, their homes, and schools. These scars may last a lifetime. Furthermore, risk of gender-based violence have heightened, while the most vulnerable, often women, boys, girls, and older people, face the greatest challenges. President, for more than 2 years now, we have witnessed an unprecedented suffering and loss for Ukraine and her people. Russia's war of aggression is an affront to the principles to which the UN was built and constitutes a violation of international law, including the UN Charter. Russia's attacks continue to blatantly violate international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The Russian Federation must be held to account for the damage caused by the senseless war and for all other serious crimes committed. We express our full support to the mandate of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine under the auspices of the Human Rights Council, as well as to the important work undertaken by the Register of Damage caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. In closing, Mr. President, Malta reiterates that the only way to achieve a just and lasting peace would be for Russia to unconditionally and completely withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank the Director of OCHA, Ms. Doughton, and Ms. Caitlin Howarth, Director of the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab's Conflict Observatory Team, for their briefings. We welcome that voices of science are being brought to address this Council. In the meantime, in Ukraine, facts confirm the continuation of massive attacks on the civilian population and infrastructure. Switzerland condemns all these attacks, which have killed and injured civilians in populated areas. Last week alone, several children were injured and schools and a hospital were damaged. As Ukraine fights for its future, all those who can build it, including children, must be protected. The civilian population and civilian infrastructure must never be targets. Once again, we call on all parties to strictly respect IHL and to protect the civilian population and infrastructure. We have observed an increase in attacks on critical energy infrastructures. In total, 9 regions across Ukraine, including those far from the front lines, have experienced disruptions to their electricity supply last week. The situation around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remains worrying. The 5 principles established by the IAEA for the prevention of an accident at this nuclear power plant must be respected in all circumstances. All aspects of life are affected by ongoing attacks. Millions of homes have been left without electricity, heating, or water supplies due to power cuts. The worrying developments in Kharkiv Oblast demonstrate the humanitarian impact of the intensified hostilities. Imagine for a moment what it means to live your daily life in Ukraine today. Workers who travel to work by train are putting their lives at risk because of attacks on railway installations, as has happened in Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Cherkasy. Students who rely on e-learning are denied access to education due to power cuts, and humanitarian personnel risk their safety as they deliver essential aid under difficult conditions. Under international humanitarian law, humanitarian actors must never be attacked, and their mission must be respected and protected. Mr. President, Switzerland reiterates that Russia must put an end to its military aggression against Ukraine. We remain determined to do everything in our power to contribute to a just and lasting peace in Ukraine in accordance with the UN Charter. It is in this spirit that Switzerland will host the first high-level summit for peace in Ukraine on June 15th and 16th. We are aware that the road to a genuine peace process will be a long one. However, Switzerland is convinced that setting up a platform for high-level discussions represents an important step forward. We hope to be able to count on the participation from all regions of the world to create a common understanding of what a possible peace process requires and to define together a roadmap on how to involve both sides in a future peace process. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Ms. Doughton and Ms. Howard for their timely and insightful briefings. It is deeply regrettable that Russia has escalated its unjustifiable attacks against Ukraine in recent months and further expanded the front into Ukraine's northeastern borders near Kharkiv over the last week, despite the international community's condemnations. As Russia's full-scale invasion has persisted for more than 2 years, we are witnessing an erosion of our common principles intended to save people from the scourge of war. The brutalities of the war in Ukraine are not only demonstrated by more than 10,000 civilian casualties, but also by the impacts of the war reverberating into global food security, regional nuclear safety, and massive destruction of infrastructure. In recent months, in addition to attacking hospitals and schools, Russia has also been targeting the energy infrastructure across Ukraine. including thermal and hydroelectric power plants and gas storage, as Ms. Doughton eloquently described today. According to recent media report, 80% of the thermoelectric power plants in Ukraine were damaged, and Ukraine's power generation has decreased by 30% as a result of Russia's attacks. This tactic apparently aims to cripple Ukraine's basic functions and demoralize the Ukrainian people's ability to fight against the aggressor. Such actions are unacceptable, as targeting civilian infrastructure is in violation of international humanitarian law, as articulated in the first protocol additional to the Geneva Conventions, particularly when they are indispensable to the survival of civilian population. Today, critical energy infrastructure holds far more significance in people's daily lives than decades ago, when international humanitarian laws were created and developed. Therefore, they deserve particular protection by warring parties. In addition to hindering access to electricity for millions of Ukrainians in the short term, the destruction of energy infrastructure has long-enduring impacts on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Indeed, the recent ICRC report highlights domino effects, where the destruction of energy infrastructure leads to the disruption of other basic services such as the delivery of water and sanitation. And the lack of safe water, sanitation, and electricity can all impair the requisite operation of hospitals and the viability of food production and distribution, leading to the spread of disease, death, and displacement, disproportionately affecting children and women. Needless to say, drastic increase in humanitarian needs caused by the collapse of the critical energy infrastructure will make effective and coordinated humanitarian operations on the ground even more challenging. Lack of access to essential services will make both recovery and reconstruction there even harder in the long term. Mr. President, as repeatedly emphasized in the previous meetings, my delegation once again stresses that all the devastating events and human suffering transpiring in Ukraine are a result of Russia's illegal invasion. This must end now to save lives and restore humanity. The Republic of Korea will continue to stand with the people of Ukraine and provide vital assistance in the areas of security, humanitarian aid, and reconstruction until they achieve just and lasting peace as well as sustainable prosperity in their land. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China. You have the floor.
President, I would like to thank the two briefers for their briefings. As the Ukraine crisis grinds on, recently there has been some escalation of ground clashes, and horrific attacks occur from time to time, resulting in huge casualties and grave humanitarian impact. China is deeply concerned about this.